Hi there, my name is Lauren and I'm the maker behind Vintage Knitting Party. I am coming to you today with a video all about resizing your vintage patterns. I hate the sinking feeling that you get when you look at a vintage pattern that you really love, you know that you really want to knit it, and then you look at the sizing and they are so tiny all of the time. Most of the time vintage patterns only come in one size, and it might be a 30 or 32 inch bust, maybe 34 if you're lucky. I would also like to mention that during this video we are going to be talking about measurements and sizing and bodies, and that can be a really touchy subject. If this is something that is difficult for you to listen to, just tread lightly. It's totally fine if you don't want to watch this video. It's totally okay if you find it a little bit confronting to measure your body and to look at those measurements. I totally understand and I totally resonate with that. I would just urge you to look at these numbers as just numbers. Just take it back to like primary school days, like doing maths equations, trying to figure things out, just simple multiplication. Do try not to apply any judgment to yourself, especially if you don't fit into the typical sizing that vintage patterns come in. They're so small. Not just like small in size, but like small in the range of sizes that they offer. And honestly, a big part of that was because people generally had knowledge about how to resize these patterns. Bodies are just bodies, numbers are numbers, that's all there is to it. You deserve to have a garment that fits you so well, and you deserve to have that proud feeling of making it fit and being able to enjoy vintage knitting. That's what this is all about. This isn't about feeling excluded or feeling like you can't knit any of them. I don't think a single vintage pattern that I've knit has actually come in my size and that I've actually just been able to go in and follow the instructions for it. I've had to resize every pattern that I've ever knit. There are certainly ones that I'd like to knit in the future which come in my size, and like that's really exciting, but yeah, for the time being I've had to resize everyone, and like that's fine because it means that I've ended up with sweaters that I love. My bust measurement ranges between a 38 and 40 inch bust, and it isn't very often that I come across patterns that are already in my size. On top of the original sizing issues, we often have to find modern yarn to fit into the tension of vintage patterns, which means that you're not always going to get the original gauge, and sometimes you're going to need to do some maths to check if the pattern is still going to fit you. So I wanted to make a video all about my process. I have 3 patterns this winter which I would love to knit. None of them came in my size originally, but we're going to do some maths and we're going to figure out the new stitch count to make them fit my size. Now, I've been thinking about making this video for a while. I've received a lot of feedback from you guys saying that this is something that you've been really interested in learning about, but it has been a little bit of a difficult video to think about filming because there's not a one size fits all that is going to work for every single vintage pattern. They're all so different, and that's why we love them. That's why I thought I would take you through 3 different examples. One of them is plain stocking stitch. One of them is 2x2 rib, and one of them is a pattern with cables. They are all slightly different, and we're going to be figuring out what modifications I'm going to need to make. I don't want you to be frightened by the fact that there will be a little bit of maths and calculations in this video. Knitting is maths. It absolutely is maths. Even if you don't feel like you've been doing maths, that's exactly what it is. When we knit, we have a certain amount of stitches that fit into a certain allotted space, and that is your gauge. So that's why it's so important to gauge swatch, to know what tension you're knitting at so that you know these are the amount of stitches that fit within an inch. When we think about how a garment like a sweater is constructed, there is a certain amount of inches around the bust that you'd like to be able to fit your body. There's a certain amount of inches around the waist, and using each of those measurements alongside how many stitches fit into an inch, all we need is to multiply that stitch tension per inch by how many inches we're going to end up needing. So it's actually quite simple. It's very, very simple, I promise you. The first example that we're going to be talking through is a lovely little stockinette stitch sweater with this basket of flowers motif all over it. I have ended up knitting this swatch, blocking it, and then doing the duplicate stitch pattern on top of it to make sure I like the colours before I embark on the whole sweater. And this is the swatch that I'm going to be using for my little maths exercise to figure out how many stitches I'll need to cast on for my size. I love doing gauge swatches. Honestly, I know it's not for everybody, but it really should be. There is just nothing better than romanticizing swatching. This is a small snippet of an entire sweater that you're going to be making. It is so worth doing so that it turns out really nicely, but it's also like, think of it as instant gratification that you get this tiny little piece of fabric that like you already get to see how the yarn is going to work, you already get to see how beautiful that pattern is, or how nice the tension's going to be, and you know, you get to experience that without having to do 4 inches of ribbing, which is really exciting to me. So I love doing gauge swatches, but if you're going to be doing calculations for resizing a vintage pattern, it really is essential. This is a fairly small swatch. I would say this is the minimum size that you can do. You definitely want to make sure that your swatch isn't just 1 inch by 1 inch. The reason for that is that fabric stretches when there is weight and pressure put on it. Even when you do a swatch and then you block that swatch, it is going to grow even more if it were a part of a larger garment. Stocking stitch maybe doesn't grow quite as much as lace or cables, but it does have a tendency to curl in on itself, and blocking that is really going to help. So I have knitted this swatch, I have blocked it. I've also done the same with the other swatch that I'm going to be talking about, and we really need an accurate measurement to be able to do our calculations. So let's get into the maths. I specifically bought this yarn from Bendigo Woolen Mills because of the tension that was listed on the website, which was 28 stitches to 10 centimeters on a 3.25 millimeter needle. That is the size needle that is used in most vintage patterns. It's the size that's used in the Basket of Flowers sweater, and I knew that I wanted the base of this sweater to be cream, so it worked out perfectly. I still did my gauge swatch to make sure that my tension wasn't too tight or too loose, and luckily my swatch did come out at a perfect 7 stitches per inch, which is exactly what the pattern called for, so that's amazing to know. Like I said, my bust measurement goes between 38 and 40 inches. I always knit my sweaters more towards the 38 or even less side of things because I want that classic negative ease look of a 1940s sweater. So I'm doing my calculations to be 38 inches on this one. We're going to separate that 38 inches of the bust into the front and the back because this is knit in pieces, and of course, you know, we need to divide that in half, and that will be 19 inches across the front and 19 inches across the back. If we were to multiply that 19 inches by 7 stitches, because that's how many stitches we need to fill up each one of those inches, we get to a total of 133 stitches across the bust for each side, the front and the back. The pattern calls for this to be an even number, so I'm just rounding it up to 134 stitches on each side, because if we're going to be seaming the sweater, you then often eat up that border stitch on the edge by seaming it together anyway. Now, it's all well and good to figure out how many stitches you want to end up with across the bust of a sweater, but a lot of sweaters end up having shaping or increases and decreases somewhere between where you cast on down near the waist and, by the time you get up to the bust, you've ended up with a different number. So that's not the amount of stitches that we need to cast on. That's just what we end up with up here by the time we get to the widest point of the sweater. So what we need to do is read the pattern and do a little bit of maths to go backwards. This pattern has you do a block of ribbing at the bottom near the waist and then increase in either side 8 times every 6th row, so you end up with a total of 16 total increases. 134 total stitches at the bust minus these 16 increases equals 118 stitches. So that is our cast on number. I went ahead and calculated what 118 divided by 7 was because I wanted to know how many inches the waist would be across if I still had that 7 stitches per inch gauge. Obviously it's going to be a little bit tighter at the ribbing where I'm on smaller needles and it is ribbed, but by the time we go into that stocking stitch, I kind of wanted to know how big that would be on me. And that ended up being a 33.7 inch waist in total. So obviously I've done that multiplication, and then I multiply that by 2 because I have the front and the back, and that's a perfect waist measurement for me. You can also use this maths to be able to see whether the arms are going to fit you okay on the sleeves. I need about 14 inches in the widest part of the sleeve across that biggest part of my bicep to fit comfortably with a little bit of positive ease that is typical of 1940s patterns. I took the total amount of stitches across the widest part of the sleeve and divided that by 7, and it was spot on 14 inches, which was so exciting because it means that I only had to resize the body of the sweater and I didn't need to resize the arm. So that is often something that happens for me. It won't be the case for everybody. Some people may find that they only need to resize the sleeves. It's just because of the way that weight distributes on my body. My limbs often don't change in size much, but my torso does, and that's perfectly fine. I think that's how my Felina sweater ended up being a little bit on the bigger side. The body was actually quite comfortable, but the sleeves are a little bit big. So eventually down the track, I may actually end up ripping back those sleeves and knitting them again because I increased them without really doing a lot of calculations. I kind of just assumed because I had to resize the body so much that the sleeves would also need that, but it turns out they really didn't. So that is one sweater all resized, so exciting. I would definitely recommend starting off with a stockinette sweater as your first sweater to resize for a couple of reasons. Because when you are doing a pattern repeat with a certain amount of stitches, you either need to add a couple of stitches just in stockinette down the sides of the body, or you need to go up by an entire pattern repeat. So say a lace pattern repeat is 20 stitches, you either need to add 20 stitches or take away 20 stitches, which is quite an amount, unless you want just a couple of extra stitches on the side that you're happy to be in like a stockinette stripe. That is also perfectly fine. I think a stockinette sweater is a little bit easier because you don't even have to think about that. You don't have to think, well, how many pattern repeats is that? It's literally just the amount of stitches, and a pattern like this that kind of is just increasing on the sides, and it's a very simple little calculation to get back to that original cast on number. It's really, really easy to do. When you get to decreasing for the arms, I have quite broad shoulders, so I tend to still do the arm decreases the same in most patterns. Sometimes I distribute them a little bit more evenly, but it's most of that extra width that is added into my sweaters I end up sort of kneading across the chest, and that is, I guess, just something that I know about my body. So there's no exact science to where all those extra stitches end up going when you get to the shaping at the top of the sweater, but just try and distribute them as evenly as you can. Another type of pattern that I would recommend using as your first venture into resizing vintage knitting patterns would be something like a ribbed vest, like the Mavis Slinky, which is the second pattern that I'm going to be resizing. I have a little bit of this yarn left over from a sweater that I'm almost finished making, and the sweater actually has 2x2 rib on the cuffs and the hem and the neckline, and I love how it looks in this yarn. I didn't do a swatch for this one because I have just completed all of this ribbing on that sweater, and it's exactly the same yarn on exactly the same needle size, and I actually think it would be more accurate to go by the maths of that sweater and how that measures, because it's a bigger garment and it's a bigger piece of fabric, so it's going to be weighed down in the same way that this finished garment would be, and therefore it's a little bit more accurate when it comes to measuring. The reason I think this would be another good starting point when it comes to resizing your vintage sweaters is that you again don't have a very strict amount of stitches per pattern repeat that you have to abide by. Ribbing is quite forgiving generally, and a slinky or a vest is also a great idea for resizing because you actually don't have to worry about resizing the sleeves, and that's great. The Mavis Slinky also doesn't have any shaping between the waist and the armpit shaping, I suppose. Like there's no increases and decreases. So once you get that bust measurement across the widest part of the vest, there's actually no other maths. There's no other ribbing. There's nothing else to do because it's ribbed. It really hugs your body and it doesn't need that extra shaping. So I measured what my tension was on the other sweater that has the same stitch, same needles and everything. and that was 8 stitches to the inch, which luckily is what the pattern calls for from memory, so that's exciting. I did the same calculation on what I would want the front and the back to be, which is 19 inches for each the front and the back, equaling a total of 38 inches. So it's just a little bit on the snug side for me and has that lovely negative ease look that I prefer. 8 stitches per inch times 19 inches equals 152 stitches. That's all you need to do for this one. So easy, love it. There's no increases or decreases in the body, and 152 also divides evenly by 4, which is really convenient because this is a 2x2 rib, so it wouldn't matter too much. I don't think it might look a little bit messy on the sides if you didn't end up with a number that was divisible by 4, but it will just make it that little bit neater, I think, having a really nice even rib all the way around. So I love this one. Again, once you get to that armpit shaping, just to distribute those extra stitches as evenly as you can. Try and go by the pattern and then think, well, I had to add in maybe 20 total stitches, so like where are those 20 stitches going to go? And pay attention to your particular body shape to see whether you actually need any extra space in the chest, in the armpits, wherever that is. Now, the third pattern that I'm going to be talking about is probably the most complicated one for a couple of reasons. There is both increases and decreases in the body of the vest, and there is a pattern. So the pattern is the cotillion vest, which I just think is so beautiful. It's got these lovely columns of stockinette and cables, which are so lovely and delicate. It's really, really pretty. And this one is a little bit different because my swatch actually came out much bigger than what they recommend in the pattern. This yarn was gifted to me. I don't know much about its origins, but it just looked fairly fine. I was like, you know what, I'll see how I go with the recommended needles. In all honesty, when it comes to knitting this vest, I'll probably do another swatch in a smaller needle size to see whether I like it a bit more, and I'll then, you know, if I do like it more, it'll obviously be a different tension and I'll have to redo these calculations. But for the sake of the video, if I did happen to go with this tension, we'll see what would happen there. So the tension in the pattern isn't like an amount of stitches per inch, it's more like an amount of patterns per inch. So there is 1 pattern to 1.5 inches in my swatch. And again, knowing that the bust size that I'm looking for is 38 inches or 19 for the front and the back, I divided that 19 by 1.5 to know how many pattern repeats I would need for each of the front and the back. The number that actually came out of the calculator was like 12 point something. So I am going to be doing 12 pattern repeats. I'm not going to be going up to 13 because I think that would be too big. I'm going to be doing 12, so that is 12 pattern repeats times 11 stitches per pattern repeat, and that comes to 132 stitches. The pattern also then is written with 9 border stitches, so a total of 9 with the couple of stitches before and after when the pattern sort of begins, because I guess the pattern repeat doesn't technically begin with the very first stitch. There's like a couple of knit stitches beforehand. So 132 plus 9 border stitches is 141 stitches in total for the front and the back. Knowing that those border stitches would exist, I guess like that's another reason why I decided to stick to 12 pattern repeats and not go up to 13, because I think going up to 13 and then having the border stitches would just be too big. And being a cable lacy pattern, this is very, very stretchy. So I really wanted to make the most of that. I knew that having a bit more negative ease would be really comfy with this pattern. Again, that is the bust measurement. That is the widest part of the vest. That 141 stitches is going to be really, really good for me. But there is shaping in this pattern as well. So I worked backwards from that measurement. I looked through the pattern from the waist up to the bust. You increase by 20 stitches in total. So I've gone back to 121 stitches at the waist. And then between the waist and the hips, I suppose, where the pattern actually begins, there's a difference of 6 stitches. So that will take our 121 back up to 127. So 127 is the total amount of stitches that I'll be casting on. I'll be doing those decreases as the pattern instructs, and then I'll be able to get back up to that certain measurement. I then did my calculations to make sure that this waist measurement would actually fit me. It came up at around 34 inches, which is good. It's still a little bit of negative ease for me, but again, with this pattern being nice and stretchy, that's the look that I'm going for. So even though these three patterns are so different and these calculations are unique to the yarn that I'm using, the measurements of my body and the patterns that I'm looking at casting on, I hope you can see that there's some sort of formula there. All you need to know is the bust measurement that you would like your finished garment to be, which may or may not be the same as the measurement of your body. Your body and the garment may be different sizes. The garment may be smaller, giving you negative ease because it's nice and stretchy. The garment may be bigger because you have a little bit more space in it to move around comfortably. You need to know that bust measurement of the garment, and you need to know your tension. And that's why we swatch, so that we know how many stitches are going to be in each inch. You know how many inches you need, so it's simple multiplication. I'm always happy to answer any questions that you have about this sort of stuff. I know that it's not always this straightforward. I've been lucky enough with the patterns that I've knit that it has been fairly easy to calculate how many stitches I need, but I know that some patterns, especially when it comes to cardigans where you have, a button placket, and sometimes you have really elaborate shaping and you have different patterns and all sorts of things that happen, it can definitely get complicated. So I'm always here to answer your questions and to try and problem solve with you. If that's something that you need, feel free to message me on Instagram and we can chat about it. I know that it can be a little bit challenging, and I know that it can seem overwhelming. There's a lot of investment that goes into knitting a garment, so it can feel like so much lost time if you haven't, ended up with the size that works for you. There's so many reasons why that can happen, but knitting is meant to be fun. Sometimes if we have to do this little bit of maths, it can seem really painful, but it can, allow you to end up with a garment that you'll really enjoy. If you just don't want to do that, I do have on my website, you can filter by bust size. Not every garment comes in every bust size, obviously, but some of the Sunglow patterns that I have actually include instructions for resizing patterns across like 8 different sizes. So there are a few options available if you have a different bust size. These rules would also still apply if you were downsizing a pattern, like if you needed a smaller size than what you were looking at. It's just simple maths, it's just multiplication. There's no magic there, and it does get easier and easier the more you knit, because you get a little bit more knowledge about like why different yarns work different ways and like why different stitches end up behaving differently when you block them. So please have hope that it just gets easier and easier, I promise. On that note, I will say goodbye. Happy sweater resizing. Thank you so much for watching this video. Your support means the world to me. I really welcome any feedback, comments, questions, anything like that. If you have any particular situations that you feel like these calculations don't apply to, let me know and I'll make another video, because like I said, there's a lot of different patterns out there in the world, and that's the exciting thing about vintage knitting. Thank you so much, friends. Have a wonderful day. I really hope the world is being very, very nice to you at the moment, and I will see you next time. Bye!